Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Teacher Development Webinars. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Amanullah Sand. I facilitate virtual programs at Teacher Development Webinars. Teacher Development Webinars is a social action project to support teachers and educators around the world with professional development opportunities. It is an initiative using the rise in online professional development to connect people from around the world with opportunities which they may not have had due to the old normal of face-to-face conferences. And for this webinar, I'm pleased to welcome Annie Altamirano. Altamirano holds a first-class degree in EFL from a teacher training college in Argentina and an MA in ELT in applied linguistics from the University of London. She has taught students of all ages and levels, and her experience includes teaching, teacher training, and academic management courses in Argentina and Spain. She is an international speaker and has given teacher training workshops in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. And for many years, she served as Cambridge English Speaking Examiner and as a Cambridge English Language Assessment presenter. She is currently a mentor in the Cambridge Teacher Support Service and a freelance teacher trainer. What a pleasure it is to have you at Teacher Development Webinars. Annie, welcome to Teacher Development Webinars.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Let me share my screen now.
Sure.
And here we are. Let's see.
Could you make it in full screen mode?
There we are.
Great.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, dear Manila and Teacher Development Webinars for this invitation. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you all for being here today on Saturday morning. For some of you, it's a very early morning because I've seen that there are some people from Latin America. For some of you, maybe it's evening already. I've seen some people from the Philippines. And today I would like to talk to you about assessment for learning. So, shall we start? Okay. I've called this webinar Assessment for Learning, the Road to Improvement, because this is how I feel about assessment for learning. Now, I'm sure that you are all familiar with the situation, a group of students listening to a teacher who is explaining a lesson, and then the teacher starts thinking, okay, I'm teaching this lesson, but are my students learning? And this is a big question for us teachers. Is our teaching actually leading to learning? And we obviously have a tool that helps us answer this question. And the tool is assessment. Now, there are two ways in which we can assess our students. I'm going to show you two pictures. And in these pictures, you're going to see these two different ways of assessing. And I'd like you to just quickly, in the chat box, say, picture A shows what kind of assessment? Would you say that picture A shows assessment of learning or assessment for learning? And what about picture B? Assessment of learning or for learning? Let's go with picture A. What would you say? A is of learning, right, Fernando? Very good, very good. What about picture B? Good, Nayet? Yeah, B for learning. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That's right. Of learning, Sudaf. Very good. Fidan, yes. Thank you for taking part in this. Good, great. So we have picture A shows assessment of learning or summative assessment. So assessment of learning is summative in nature. Assessment for learning is formative. So anytime we assess our students, we either assess in a summative or in a formative way. So assessment of learning is summative in nature, and it usually happens at the end of an extended period of teaching, maybe at the end of a unit of work, at the end of an academic year, a semester, a term, and the purpose is determining who has mastered the content and to what extent. Now, assessment for learning is formative rather than summative. So let's see. End of term exams and standardized tests are examples of summative assessment. Yes or no? What would you say in the chat? End of term are examples of summative? Yes, that's right. Ramshan Mohammed, Irina, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And exit tickets, impromptu quizzes are examples of formative assessment. Yes or no? What would you say? Right, yes. Great, great, lovely, good. So, that is, assessment for learning is formative because the purpose is not to determine who succeeded and who didn't, but to provide guidance to the student through specific descriptive feedback. Here we have two very interesting definitions of what assessment for learning is. It emphasizes learning rather than grading. Students do not receive a grade. They receive feedback that helps them to improve. Therefore, what makes assessment formative is what the teacher does with the information the assessment generates. When you use formative assessment to identify the present status of a student in relation to the learning standard, you diagnose what to do to assist them, you provide feedback, and you allow the student to make changes. A key resource developed by the Assessment for Learning Reform Group put together these 10 basic principles of assessment for learning. First, it should be part of effective planning. That is, when we plan our lessons, we should provide opportunities for us and the students to obtain and use information about their progress towards the learning goals. It should focus on how students learn. The process of learning has to be in the minds of both the students and us teachers when we plan this assessment and when the evidence is interpreted. And learners should be aware of the how they learn as they are of the what they learn. It should also be a central feature of classroom practice. That is, much of what we do in classrooms can be described as assessment. That is, tasks and questions prompt learners to demonstrate their learning, their understanding, and their skills. So, assessment is central to classroom practice. It also should be seen as a key professional skill. And as a teacher trainer for many years, and also as a teacher training in pre-service training, in teacher training college, I've always insisted on this. That is, we need to help teachers become aware of what assessment for learning involves and give them the tools to implement assessment for learning in their lessons. It should be seen as a sensitive and constructive process. That is, we need to be aware of the impact that comments, gradings, marks can have on a student's confidence. And we should be as constructive as possible in our feedback. Also, We should never underestimate the importance of student motivation. Assessment that encourages learning fosters motivation, because it emphasizes progress and achievement rather than failure. We are always focusing on the positive side of the learning. Yes. Also, it should encourage remote understanding of the criteria by which the learning goals are assessed. For effective learning to take place, learners need to understand what it is that they are trying to achieve, and of course, want to achieve it. So, communicating the assessment criteria involves discussing these assessment criteria with the learners in learner-friendly language, and also providing examples of how these criteria can be met in practice. We should also give guidance to students, constructive guidance on how to improve learning. Because it's not enough to say, oh, great, you have done a wonderful piece of work, or you should try harder, and not tell them what they have done well and how they can try harder. And also, assessment for learning, very importantly, it should develop the learner's capacity for self-assessment. Teachers should pinpoint the learner's strengths and advise how to develop these strengths. We should be clear and constructive about weaknesses and how they might be addressed. And we should provide opportunities for learners to improve upon their work. Because this capacity of self-assessment is not just beneficial academically speaking, it is a life skill. And finally, we should recognize the full range of educational achievement. That is, we should equip learners with the desire and the capacity to take charge of their learning through developing these skills of self-assessment. So let's have a look now at how assessment for learning fits into the classroom cycle. It focuses, I would say, on both us teachers and students understanding three things: where the learner is going, that is, sharing the aims of the lesson and success criteria helps learners to see what they are aiming for and what they need to do in order to achieve those aims. Also, where the learner is now. That is, techniques such as, for example, effective questioning will help us gauge what individual students and groups have learned during a lesson. And in this way, we are generating evidence of learning that we can use and the students can use in order to improve and design further work. And the third aspect is, how can the learner get there? That is, using the evidence of learning, we are informing choices about what students will do next with the class, or what we will do next with the class or with individual students. Also, students will be able to make decisions about their learning. For example, how to spend their independent study time. Now, one of the most important and pertinent findings from research and past practice is that assessment for learning is a continual cycle, as you can see. Assessment begins with thorough planning. Planning is key, is critical. Sorry. So we should be planning our lessons, having clear learning intentions or learning objectives, because learning intentions can be called in different ways. Learning intentions, learning objectives, learning aims. So having clear learning intentions to direct our students in their learning and provide suitable input. Here we have it. Suitable input and learning activities. Yes. Also, as I said, planning is critical, and we must consider framing the learning intentions into our planning. These learning intentions declare the learning rather than the activity that the pupils are going to engage with. You can see here also that there is an improvement stage, which follows self-formative feedback and self-assessment and evaluation. This is an important part of assessment for learning. Once the feedback is offered to students, they have the opportunity to read, process, and respond to the improvement suggestions and prompts made in the feedback. And so when they carry out these improvements, they carry it out not just for future work, but also for the work in question. So when you are implementing this, that is, you may be, at this point, you may be overwhelmed by the number of things that I'm saying, but when you are integrating assessment for learning into your classroom practice, it's advisable to take one area at a time and develop that area rather than rush into a quick succession of changes that will really overwork you and overwhelm you. Okay, now let's see. Assessment for learning have some basic components, and these basic components are these ones. Yes, we have learning intentions that inform the students about what they are going to learn and why. The success criteria that help students and us teachers measure student performance. Formative feedback that provides the students with information on the successful areas of their learning, as well as areas for improvement. And these feedback should be based on the agreed success criteria. Also, effective questioning, that is, asking questions in such a way that they provide you with key information that you can use in order to determine where the learning currently is, expand the learning, and plan for future learning. And it also refers to student questioning, not just us. And finally, peer and self-assessment that consider not only what pupils and their peers have learned, but how they have learned it and what to learn next. So we are going to focus on some of these elements in more depth. So let's begin with the learning intentions and the success criteria. As I said before, we are familiar with this and we use different terms for this: objectives, goals, aims. Now, a learning intention describes what the pupils, what the students should know, understand, or be able to do by the end of the lesson or at the end of a series of lessons. And the word intention is used deliberately because it puts greater emphasis on the process of learning rather than on the end product. So a learning intention is simply a description of what you want the pupils to know, understand, or be able to do at the end of the lesson. For example, here, suppose that students are working with vocabulary, so the learning intention could be: students will understand the meaning of key vocabulary words and use the words correctly. This is the intention. Notice that this is not the activity. I'm not describing here any activity. I'm saying what I expect students to do, what I expect them to learn. The next element is success criteria. So the learning intentions spell out what the students will learn and why. The success criteria show pupils how to recognize success. They let students know if they have achieved the learning intention. Yes? So suppose that we go on working with the vocabulary. So the success criteria could be selecting correct words when given word meaning, generate sentences that include vocabulary terms. So when students, perhaps you are familiar with I can statements or students can statements. What students can do. Okay, those are the success criteria. So establishing success criteria is as important as learning intentions because it improves students' understanding by keeping them informed about how they will be assessed also. Despite building intentions and learning intentions and success criteria in our planning, and also having them in most course books nowadays, we rarely share them with our pupils. But at the same time, we want them to be self-motivated and have a sense of purpose. So how are they going to do that if we don't tell them? What do we expect them to do? What do we expect them to learn? And how to recognize that they have achieved these intentions? So to give our pupils the tools they need to take more responsibility for their own learning and achieve greater learning independence, we need to tell them what they are going to learn, why they should learn it, and how they will recognize when they have succeeded. And research shows that when students receive this information, they are more focused for longer periods of time, they are more motivated, and they are also more able to take responsibility for their own learning. So these two elements of assessment for learning are important because if learners, and I never stop insisting on this, if learners don't know what they are expected to learn and how to recognize their own success, they cannot promote peer or self-assessment, which are two other elements of assessment for learning, as well as very important life skills. So, let's see. Now, we are going to have a look at these, let's say, feedback prompts. Here we have some feedback prompts, right? We have been saying that formative assessment is very important. So, which of these examples of quality feedback do you think are the best? We have here examples of feedback. Which of these are examples of quality formative feedback? Which would you say? A, B, C, D, or E? Let's see what you say in the chat box. B and E. E. Okay. All right. So B, E, good. Yes, E. All right. So let's see. Let me make. I have lots of things that appear on my screen. Don't allow me to see the chat or the screen. Now, so let's see. Here we have, for example, C and D. You must try harder, develop these ideas further. Okay. These two prompts do not really give enough direction to the pupil on how to improve their work. Okay, they have to try harder. Doing what? Develop the ideas further. How? Give prompts, give some cues, give some hints. A is positive. Beautiful, neat work. Yes. It gives praise. Yes. But it doesn't highlight exactly what the pupil did well. You could add here something like interesting ideas, good use of linkers. You have presented very good examples. I mean, explain what made this piece of work so good. So B and E are quality formative feedback because the pupil is giving guidance on how to improve. So try one of these adjectives or one of your own instead of that. So you're giving a hint. The other one, very good start. Count how many times you have used said. What might have you used instead? So we are giving not just feedback, but also interesting hints on how to improve. So, as Hattie and Temperley say, formative feedback is the most powerful single moderator in the enhancement of achievement. Feedback is only successful if students' learning improves, and this depends on their capacity to understand the feedback and the inclination to accept it and to act on it. It's got a motivational and interpersonal element, I would say, that we cannot ignore. And the goal is to change the students' capacity to produce better work, not just to improve it. Now, what are the characteristics of feedback? We know feedback can be given by the teacher or by peers, but in both cases, it has the same characteristics. So we should be telling the students what they have done well, how they have done it, how to improve, and they need to understand what you said, accept what is being said, be willing to make the change and implement the change. Yes? And we need to base feedback on the learning goals and avoid comparisons. Yes? We should focus on 2 or 3 critical feedback points at a time, because otherwise students do they suffer from the hypo. Have you seen hippos when they go under the water? What they do is they have a membrane that closes their ears. Okay, students suffer from the hippo syndrome. If they see too many things on the page, they just close their ears or their eyes and they don't pay attention, they switch off. So focus on only 2 or 3 critical points at a time and provide concrete suggestions for improvement. As we have seen, avoid vague general feedback. Also, directly communicate the strength or the gap to the student. This relates to providing concrete suggestions for improvement. Tell them, okay, here, you have done this really well. The organization of these ideas is excellent. You have organized your essay, for example, in a very logical way. The paragraphs are very neatly divided. Very good. The gap, maybe. You should pay more attention to the use of linkers. Perhaps if you revised linkers between paragraphs, it would be a good idea. Again, suggest small, manageable change rather than large, complex change. Set, let's say, mini milestones so that students experiment small successes that lead to the final success. Also, give immediate or timely feedback. Feedback that is given a long time after the work has been done is not useful. And make it constant. That is, don't do it just once in a while. Make it something constant in your lessons. Also, allow for students' own feedback. Encourage them to self-assess and change strategies to transform learning gaps into strengths, and ask for their commitment to change. Help them from knowing about the need to change to wanting to make the change. Now, another element that I mentioned was questions. Asking questions is essential for checking students' understanding and keeping them engaged with the task. And it's also crucial to the way they receive and process information. Also, good questions encourage critical thinking. Effective questioning involves using questions in the classroom to open conversations, inspire deeper intellectual thought, promote student-to-student interaction. Effective questions focus on eliciting the how and the why of the learning, as opposed to answers which just detail the what, the content. So, using effective questions in the classroom creates opportunities for students to analyze their own thinking, that of their peers, and their own work. One thing that I experienced over the years is that, okay, we ask a lot of questions, but we don't plan the questions. So sometimes our questions are not as effective as they could be. So planning the questions is a good idea, and it will save you a lot of time during the lesson. So, for example, when you are planning your class, plan also your questions. Decide on the goal and the purpose for asking the questions. Your goal should help you determine what levels of questions you will ask. Also, select the content for the questioning. Choose the material that you consider important. And ask questions that require extended responses or at least a content answer. That is, avoid questions that can be answered yes or no, unless you are going to follow those questions with more questions to expand reasoning. Also, write your main questions in advance. I mean, when we are teaching a class, we are doing so many things, and we need to remember so many things that the last thing we want to do is remember when we want to ask what question. So one thing I've done all my life is put sticky notes in the book at certain places where I wanted to ask a question, and put a note just to remind me of the question. So I know where to ask the question, because otherwise we get distracted and we are likely to forget. We are humans. Also, think of additional questions during the questioning process. This doesn't mean that is planning your questions, doesn't mean that they are written on stone and that you are not going to ask more questions or different questions as you go along. Be flexible. So you can write your questions in advance, plan the questions in some logical sequence, but also during the questioning process, be flexible and add or substitute questions depending on the situation. Phrase your questions so that the task is clear to students, and also, and I inevitably think of the next one, avoid implied response questions. That is, that our questions should not contain the answers. And also, we should try to anticipate possible student responses, because this will help us plan ahead and ask ourselves whether the questions are focusing on the goal we have in mind, whether we are allowing students to express ideas in their own words, whether we are allowing students to ask questions in turn. Because many a time what happens is that we don't allow our students to ask questions. It's always us asking questions. Okay, another element in assessment for learning is peer and self-assessment. So the 4 steps of assessment for learning include teacher assessment, peer assessment, self-assessment, and then finally we have the autonomous learner. Now, when using assessment for learning in the classroom, peer and self-assessment are effective approaches to enhance the learning of the students. Explicitly teaching students how to assess their work and the work of their peers has many benefits. It promotes students' understanding of their learning and also promotes critical analysis. Um, Peer assessment allows learners to reflect critically upon the learning of their peers, but this is a reciprocal process because in doing so, the student benefits from increasing their own understanding, having to review someone else's work. And as a result of reflecting on someone else's work, they can also reflect on their own performance and their own understanding of how they have done the task. And it helps them develop a broader view of how questions can be answered, yes, or how a task can be completed by seeing the methods their peers are using. This light bulb moment, oh, I never thought of doing this in this way. And self-assessment gives students an opportunity to use success criteria to make judgments, identify their own strengths, and set their own targets. And in this way, they understand much better what their own work is being judged against, also what good work should include or look like, and how to go about making their work better. And this is not just, as I said, an academic skill, but also a life skill. So, how can we introduce peer and self-assessment in our lessons? Identify the assignments or the activities for which students might benefit from peer and self-assessment and feedback. You don't need to do this all the time with every single exercise that you set. Consider breaking larger assignments into smaller pieces and incorporating peer assessment opportunities at each stage. Peer assessment or self-assessment, yes? So, as I said before again, having mini milestones. Involve students in defining and clarifying the success criteria so that they are involved in this, right? Work with exemplars, that is, with samples, examples of work that make the criteria visible for the students. So if you have set a list of 3 or 4 criteria for a speaking activity, okay, perhaps show a recording of the speaking activity being carried out by other students and ask the students to assess that activity using certain success criteria. Teaching them how to apply the success criteria. Explicit instruction and modeling helps them understand what constitutes quality work. Also, provide guidance as they apply the criteria. For example, applying the criteria to anonymous work you may collect work from previous years, from other classes, make a copy where an anonymous copy on a computer so that the handwriting is not recognizable, the name of the person is not there, so that they can see what good work looks like. And also help them learn to carry out peer assessment by modeling appropriate constructive criticism and descriptive feedback through your own comments on student work. Support students with prompts, with sentence starters, with assessment forms. That is, they cannot learn how to do this out of the blue. So we need to help them. We need to give them the language. Yes. So, as I say, providing prompts, sentence starters, forms. You can create simple forms. Yes. Teach them how to use feedback. And demonstrate how they can monitor their learning, which is a metacognitive strategy that is very, very useful. Combine peer assessment with your own feedback. Yes. and develop and use assessment tools with the students, for example, templates, checklists, rubrics. Use the gradual release of responsibility model. That is, you model the assessment, the feedback, you guide the instruction, you share the practice, and then finally you allow students to do it independently. Develop ground rules for giving effective feedback. Yes, you can do this as a class. Developing expressions, language, looking for language that will develop sensitive, positive feedback and effective feedback. And of course, develop these evidence moments that peer assessment, feedback, and improvements have been made, because the students do not just receive the feedback, they have to act upon it. They need to be accountable for that. Also, select appropriate strategies and tools. Teach and model all the time. Involve them in developing the success criteria in learner-friendly language so that they fully understand what they have to do. This is particularly important with low-level students or with children when they do not have enough language. So you need to involve them in developing the criteria and help them understand. Have them assess against the success criteria and not against anything else. Have them identify success, that is, the best parts of their work. Highlight areas of improvement. They highlight their own work, in their own work, the areas of improvement. Remind them at all times of the success criteria and allow time for making the improvement. In the case of self-assessment, make it a regular part of the lesson. Yes? And ensure that this is about learning, not about having grades, not about being right or wrong. I insist on this explicitly. Teach, model, and scaffold self-assessment. Show how you do it with speaking aloud and pretending that you are assessing your own work so that they can learn from your example. Use a range of techniques and tools. There are lots of ways in which, of course, this is beyond the scope of this talk, but there are lots of techniques and tools that you can use and that you can find for implementing self-assessment. Ask them to highlight the best section of their work, yes, against the success criteria. Include reflection time at the end of the lesson. This is important. 5 minutes, you don't need more than that. And you can use, for example, exit tickets, where students write in a simple sentence or use the traffic lights, red, green, and yellow in order to show how much they have understood. Discuss and practice individual goal setting so that students set their own goals. And you can also design self-assessment templates that are going to help them assess their own work in a much easier way. So, in this session, well, I'm going to show you some references that I have found very useful along the way. And in this session, we have defined what assessment for learning is, formative assessment is, what the main components are. I have given you some ideas about how to introduce it in our teaching practice. As I said, there are many, many more things to go deeper into. But I hope that this session has to some extent contributed to encouraging you to consider implementing formative assessment in your lessons. So we have come to the end of the session, but I hope that not to the end of our efforts to ensure that we use performance information to help our learners improve and succeed in their learning. Here you have my contacts. If you wish to contact me, send me an email or find me on social media, send me questions. I will be more than happy to reply to you. So thank you very much to the organization of Teacher Development Webinars for this opportunity to talk to so many teachers from so many different parts of the world.
Thank you so very much, Anna, for this wonderful talk on formative assessment for learning, what we call, and I really appreciate all the ideas. And we have some time for questions. So now the floor is open for question and answers. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll be taking your questions to Anna. So yeah, I see this question from Wasif, and Wasif says, what are the ways to which we make our assessment criteria more valid and reliable?
I think that success criteria can be made more reliable when we decide what we want to evaluate and how we want to evaluate that. When many times we have success criteria in our books, but sometimes it is not exactly what we want to assess. So when you are the one who decides, okay, in this lesson, right, the book says this, but I also want to evaluate these other aspects. And working with rubrics is very useful, and I think that makes assessment for learning and formative assessment more reliable. In a way, I think that the problem sometimes is that our mental framework is based on assessing of learning, assessment of learning, and it's very difficult for us to get out of that and get into assessment, formative assessment. I mean, both forms of assessment are, of course, in place. But when you work with rubrics, and that would give us for 2 or 3 webinars, I think, when you're working with rubrics and when you create the rubrics with your students, that is when formative assessment becomes more reliable. Because it's like working, for example, when you are, suppose that you are preparing exam classes, and you are preparing, you are helping students prepare for a speaking paper. Normally, if it is an international exam, or if it is also a national exam, there is a set of rubrics. If students get a grade C, it's because they can do this, this, and that. So we can develop similar rubrics, but based on our own perception of what we want to evaluate.
Yes, and part of the reason for this, I think, is because in our context, grading is what matters the most. So we have to get out of this phobia of grading and grades. So this way we can move more to a formative assessment. But yeah, this is a billion-dollar industry, so we can't say anything.
No, I mean, and of course you're right, but I mean, I'm not when I insist so much on assessment for learning, I don't mean that we are not going to assess the learning in at least give exams and that, because of course the educational systems in all the world require grades. If we want our students to sit for an international exam, they will have a grade, etc., etc. So assessment of learning is necessary in many ways, particularly in the real world out there. But this is something that we can do in our little world, from the door to the inside of the classroom, to get more information on how to help our students.
That makes sense. So yeah, a lot of questions around online assessment, how to implement assessment for learning in an online setting.
Well, I think that it's very much in the same way that we can do it in the classroom. All this question of online learning has, I think, has caught all teachers around the world like by surprise, because we were not used, or most of us were not used to teaching online, and suddenly from one day to the other we were thrown into a new world. But I think that there are many, many ways in which we can do formative assessment online. We can use tools such as Jamboard. We can use Padlet. I mean, we can ask students, for example, with the exit tickets that I was mentioning. The exit tickets are simply, if you're doing that in a face-to-face classroom, it's cards or sticky notes where you ask the students to write, for example, a question that they still have after your lesson. They can write, for example, how they feel they have performed today in the lesson, what they would like to learn in the next lesson, all these things. You can do the same thing with Padlet or with Jamboard, because they will do it online and they will have this link they can use in order to put the Padlets on the board, for example. You can do it in breakout rooms. If students are giving peer assessment, you can put students in breakout rooms. Yes, and so they can work together and give each other feedback, and you can pop into those breakout rooms to see what they are doing. Yes, so it gets it requires getting used to it, but I think that we have a lot of online with Google Documents, for example. We can design assessment forms in Google Documents, and they can share the documents. Yes. So I think that with online platforms we can do that, and there are lots of online tools that we can use not only in our online classes, but we can use those online tools even in our face-to-face classes. Because in contexts where the students are allowed to have, for example, their telephones, their mobile phones in the classroom, or they have tablets in the classroom and they have access to the school internet, they can do it. They can use the same tools in a face-to-face lesson.
Yeah. So yeah, another question from Imane from Algeria, and she asked, how could we assess multilingual learners?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes. So Imane asked that how could we assess multilingual learners?
How could we assess
multilingualism?
When you have a multilingual classroom?
Yep, that's right.
Well, when you have a multilingual classroom, the only common language that you have in the classroom is English. So you can assess in the same way. I mean, if you are using English, that is, English would be the lingua franca in the classroom. So students should try and give each other feedback, and you give them feedback in English. Maybe what you can do is, I must admit that I have only taught monolingual classes, or classes where most of the students spoke one language and a few of the others understood that language, even if they were not fluent, but they all spoke English. But what you can do is use the students' language to the benefit of the whole class. So you ask the students to try and say in English, or give an opinion, for example, in English, and If they have a problem, maybe they can say it in their own language. Even if you don't understand the language, they can try and explain what they mean to say. It's a slow process, and I truly admire teachers who have a multilingual class, because it is sometimes it's quite difficult, but you should be using English to the advantage. Mm-hmm. But you can do it in a multilingual class. Only that it would be English all the time.
Thanks very much, Fernando, for sharing all these resources. And question from Fernando, it's an interesting one. And he said, what are some of the examples of how students and teachers can collect data or feedback on assessment for learning? And then his other question is, how important is teacher assessment for teaching and why?
Teacher assessment.
Yeah.
Let's see, what do you mean teacher assessment? I mean, students assessing the teacher?
I think, he may be talking about teachers assessing themselves or someone else, kind of peer assessment, and then, teacher, yes, someone making accountable of, how they improve with their teaching.
Yes, yes, that's right. Yeah, it would be, that would be a very, it's a very interesting question, because we normally do not assess our own performance. Sometimes it's a good idea to record our lessons. Maybe not video record the lesson, because it is perhaps impracticable, but you with your own mobile phone, sometimes what you can do is audio record your lesson, and then pick certain aspects of your teaching that you are interested in improving or learning more about your own performance. This is called reflective teaching. And I think this is something that we should be doing all the time, reflecting on our own teaching. I think that perhaps what you can do, I mean, this is something that I have done. When you finish a class, you normally know or feel how well the class has gone. Sometimes you go out of a lesson and you say, oh, I don't like the way I gave this lesson today. Okay, sit down and think why you are not happy with the way you gave that lesson today. What do you feel didn't work? On the other hand, if you are very happy, okay, consider what strategies did you use in your lesson? What activities did you use that you feel have worked well? Keep a teaching journal, a log, where you can write down your reflections. It can be online, or written as you wish. I have found that recording myself has been very useful. Very useful. I think that's
wonderful.
Yeah, I think that somebody has, Mark has his hand up. I think he wants to ask something.
Yes, it may be, due to a mistake. Thanks very much, Anna, for this wonderful and insightful session. I really appreciate you having a teacher development webinar, and a lot of appreciation in the chat box. I can see this wonderful comment from Irina. He says, hello from Ukraine. I work with teens and I've been implementing formative assessment for 5 years. I believe in my students' mind growth, and I know that formative assessment is a powerful tool. I find this webinar very informative and profound, very logical and clear summary. Thank you a lot. Thanks very much, Irina. It was a pleasure having you, and thanks very much to all the attendees on the Teacher Development Webinars YouTube channel and here on Zoom as well. We appreciate you attending this webinar, and many thanks to you, Anna, for sharing all the wisdom and all these tools and techniques and strategies. Thanks very much. And those who are concerned, yes, those who are concerned about certificates, yes, this webinar, attending the webinar is free, but there is some cost to be paid for the certificate. So if you want certificate, you can email us on info.tdwebinars@gmail.com for the payment details, and we'll get in touch with you. For our future webinars, please look at it at website www.tdwebinars.org. We're available on all our social media channels: Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. And yeah, this recording will be placed on our Teacher Development Webinars YouTube channel for your future reference. And if you feel like sharing with colleagues, feel free to do so. And don't forget to share your takeaways with us on Twitter and tag us using hashtag TD Webinars. Thanks very much, everyone. And thanks, Anna. I appreciate you joining us here for the start.